Hello, hello, good morning. Welcome to Saturday morning coffee with Dr. Childress. Good morning. Uh, Welcome to Coffee with Dr. Childress. Today I'm going to be discussing factitious disorder imposed on another, what people generally or used to call Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It's creating a false pathology in the child for secondary gain of the parent. But before I get there, um, I want to just discuss sort of the context of what the information I'm providing to you, because factitious disorder, if you use that currently with the mental health people or talking with the courts or anybody, they'll just kind of give you a blank stare because it's not currently in the thinking of mental health professionals or the court or parents. But that is most likely the accurate diagnosis for this. It's a false disorder, the attachment pathology, created for secondary gain of the parent, which is to nullify the court's orders for custody and potentially a revenge motivation against the targeted parent. The means by imposing the false attachment pathology onto the child is by creating a shared persecutory delusion. So the persecutory delusion is still applicable and it's still an accurate diagnosis. It's just recognizing that the creation of the delusional disorder is manipulative. And we'll get into that. It's Machiavellian manipulation associated with the dark triad, vulnerable dark triad, and dark tetrad personalities. So those are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellian manipulation. That's the dark triad. And it's the Machiavellian manipulation that moves into the factitious disorder imposed on another for secondary gain. They're imposing a pathology on the child to manipulate the courts, basically. But that information is the factitious disorder imposed on another is going into my reports at this point. So that's what I'm sort of bringing it up and putting it into the ether out there because it's in my reports. It's one of the rule out considerations for this pathology. And I'm sort of the tippy tip of the very spear. So what I'm doing is going to have impact later down the road as people start to catch up. So if you try to use it now, you might just kind of run into some blank stares and things. But my goal is to provide you with the latest, most recent information that if you can use it and find it helpful, great. Otherwise, it'll take me probably another couple of years before this begins to move into solutions. And let me just talk about that for a second. If you're all waiting for me to solve this pathology all by myself, yeah, I'll do that. I've been doing that for the last 10 years, and we're nearing sort of completion on that. So it's about another 2 to 5 years away to where I will completely solve the pathology in the family courts all by myself. It'd be helpful if I had help. It'll go faster. The people who should be helping are the licensing boards. They're the ones that are responsible for competence, and that's the issue, is the lack of professional competence in the psychologists, all of them, any of them. And they don't care. No one seems to care. The AFCC doesn't care. The licensing boards don't care. The APA doesn't care. And there's a bunch of reasons for that that I can describe later in another APA presentation or something. But that's the current system, is it's all locked up in ignorance, apathy, and incompetence. And there's massive violations to ethical standards and duty to protect and all sorts of stuff. But they don't care. So until there's a motivation to solve the pathology from the mental health people and the legal system, the ethics board, the APA, then nothing's going to get solved until I get everything solved. And the way I'm doing it is by holding mental health professionals accountable for their obligations or ethical obligations or duty to protect obligations. And they're not competent. Standard 2.01, 2.04, 2.03. All the twos are competence standards. They're also in violation of 9.01 bases of assessment, and they're also failing in their duty to protect obligations on two counts: to the child, failing to protect the child from psychological child abuse, and failing to protect the parent from spousal abuse, psychological abuse, using the child as a weapon. So it's just massive incompetence over here. And the fundamental failure is in the licensing boards. And the reason they're failing is because all the licensing boards surrounding the courts are under the control of the forensic psychologists, who are the same people who are unethical and incompetent. And so they review themselves. And so it's basically a corrupt system within the licensing boards at this point. So we need outside and independent review to come in, either from a state legislators or from the APA or from the courts, regarding the professional failures, substantial professional failures over here in the family courts. You're the only pathology that's been given your own special psychologists. No other pathology has special psychologists given just for them. Not autism, not ADHD, not trauma, not eating disorders. All the other pathologies are treated by clinical psychologists. You're the only pathology that gets a special group. And they acknowledge right up front, the forensic custody evaluators, they acknowledge they don't diagnose or treat the pathology that they work with. They just do these bloated, inconsequential custody evaluations that solve nothing but except make them a lot of money. And so that's the problem. You've been isolated away from the other mainstream psychologists where there's actual knowledge. And the reason is for that is because you're too dangerous. So psychology has kind of isolated you because you're professionally dangerous to us. So clinical psychologists are now have abandoned you, and you've got the worst possible practice psychologists over here. So my efforts are directed toward holding individual psychologists now accountable for their ethical standards and professional competence standards, duty to protect obligations. I'm doing it one case at a time because that's what you guys want. The parents are all focused on your individual case, and the attorneys are all focused on that individual case. And the mental health people aren't motivated to solve anything because they're exploiting you financially, or they are just simply apathetic and don't care. And so I'm doing it case by case by this point. At some point, that will provoke a risk management response out of the forensic people and out of psychology generally, at which point they'll get the motivation to be ethical and to solve pathology and to protect children from child abuse and the spouses from spousal abuse. But until they're motivated, they don't do anything. So that's the sort of the context of what's happening. But within my personal private practice, one case at a time, I just want to let you know that I've opened up a kind of a new door, which is the factitious disorder imposed on another. I've been preparing everybody with the family systems, constructs, cross-generational coalition, emotional cutoff, child's triangulated. Those are all the basic descriptive definitions of the pathology. I've been preparing everybody for the diagnostic issues, which are over on the shared persecutory delusion, and the child psychological abuse diagnosis, the spousal abuse diagnosis. But now it's time to get more directly onto the pathology, which is the factitious disorder imposed on another. That's traditionally called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And I am actually highly trained one of the best trained people on Munchausen's by proxy, factitious disorder imposed on another, because that shows up at children's hospitals. And that's where I was trained and worked as a pediatric psychologist, is in children's hospitals. Let me explain how that happens. A factitious disorder, a false disorder, is generally, the Munchausen is thought as producing a medical disorder in the child for secondary gain. And the secondary gain is all the attention it gives to the pathological parent for being the nurturing parent and everything. So it's often associated with that histrionic spectrum personality pathology. It could be borderline, but it's that histrionic borderline spectrum of pathology that is traditionally associated with the factitious disorder. Uh, and that in the medical community, or in the mental health community at this point, because it's a false disorder, no one can identify what exactly is going on. And so it gets passed around from doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor as everybody tries to diagnose what it is and can't figure it out. And it's treatment resistant. And so it keeps getting referred to additional specialists. And eventually it finds its way to like the top, which is typically the children's hospital in the location. And so it gets referred into children's hospital to find out what's going on. And by that point, the chart is huge. They got a huge chart on this kid. And the physician at Children's Hospital goes in and looks at him and looks at all the tests and looks at everything and says, this isn't making sense. And so it's generally that level at that time that possibility of the factitious disorder imposed on another occurs to the physician. And what they do is they write a doctor's order for a psych consult. And the nurse calls down to the psychology department and asks for a psych consult on factitious disorder imposed on another, FDIA. And the psychology department sends up a pediatric psychologist, such as my role, to do the diagnostic assessment of possible factitious disorder imposed on another. And so, as a pediatric psychologist trained at Children's Hospital, I was trained there for 3 years, 1 year pre-doc, 2 years post-doc, and then as a pediatric psychologist on medical staff at Children's Hospital of Orange County. That's within the domain of our expected competence, is that differential diagnosis of FDIA. Now, people in the general population never see it. So nobody else out there really encounters factitious disorder imposed on another except pediatric psychologists, and typically those are at the children's hospitals where that runs up. So that's why I can recognize it and say this is what it is. And so just the structure of the factitious disorder, just think about it for a second. Just the title itself will make sense to you. Factitious disorder, it's a false disorder. The false disorder in this case is the attachment pathology of the child. And it's imposed on another, imposed on the child for secondary gain. This is giving some benefits to the parent who's producing the pathology. And in this case, the benefits, secondary gain, are clearly that it nullifies the court's authority and the court's orders for shared custody, because by producing this severe attachment pathology in the child towards the other parent. So that's the secondary gain. The linkage or the associated features of factitious disorder, traditionally for the medical, we would think about histrionic personality pathology. Over here in the family courts, we have narcissistic and borderline personality pathology that both collapse into persecutory delusions under stress, and that the manipulative secondary gain of nullifying court orders is the prominent feature of both personalities. The narcissistic and borderline are both highly manipulative personalities. But even of more concern is the dark personalities. There's three of them: dark triad, dark vulnerable dark triad, and the dark tetrad. Now, these are not diagnostic entities. They're not in the DSM-5. What they are was that they've been identified in the personality disorder research. So if you go to a different field entirely, personality disorders, and you look at their research, the research has identified these three personality types: dark triad, vulnerable dark triad, and dark tetrad. The dark triad, the first to be identified, is narcissism, psychopathy, the psychopath, and Machiavellian manipulation. And the Machiavellian word, Machiavelli was this guy in the Middle Ages who was very manipulative. And so that saying it's Machiavellian manipulation means extraordinary manipulation. It is off the charts manipulation with this character pathology. So that's the dark triad: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellian manipulation. Then the next to be identified was the vulnerable dark triad. And with that, and this is all identified in the research and the data, and with that, that's vulnerable narcissism. So the dark triad is grandiose narcissism. I'm wonderful. The vulnerable dark triad is vulnerable narcissism. I need attention from me. I just need attention because I'm vulnerable. Then the second is borderline personality pathology. So the vulnerable narcissism, borderline pathology, and Machiavellian manipulation. So essentially, you have the dark triad is the narcissistic spectrum version of the personality pathology, and the vulnerable dark triad is the borderline spectrum of the dark personality. Then the dark tetrad is if you add sadism to it. So that's really nasty. So you get narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellian manipulation, and sadism. And those are the personalities we have in the family courts. Are they all dark? No, but there's enough of them. Research estimates most parents are able to solve custody issues after divorce because they're normal range parents. They have normal range empathy for their child. So research indicates that maybe 10 to 20% of parents are unable to self-resolve the custody conflicts. The other 80 to 90% of parents after divorce are able to work out custody with minimal court involvement. 10%, 10 to 20% need more help, more like 10%. And it's estimated about 5% of the population has narcissistic personality, 5% has borderline. So it's very, very, very likely that the high conflict personalities of narcissism, borderline personality, and the dark personalities are responsible for the high conflict of repeated litigation surrounding child custody. So that's not a great stretch to anticipate that we have some significant personality pathology potentially involved. And what we want to look at specifically on that is that Machiavellian manipulation. And it's that secondary gain component. And everybody can kind of recognize it when you look at a child custody dispute, and all of a sudden the child's got attachment pathology towards one parent, and it's nullifying the court orders for child custody. Everybody kind of says, I think this could be related to the custody conflict. But they don't know how to appropriately diagnose the pathology. I do. And the pathology itself, the means for creating the false disorder in the child, the false attachment pathology, is by creating the shared persecutory delusion. And so that's the diagnosis that we want in there, the shared persecutory delusion. The other thing that occurs by putting that differential diagnosis on the table of a shared persecutory delusion is that it flips the false allegations of abuse to be bidirectional, which means if those abuse allegations are not true, then they are symptoms of the persecutory delusion. So, one way or the other, they are symptoms of child abuse. Either it's authentic allegations of child abuse or it's psychological child abuse by producing a shared persecutory delusion in the child. So, every single one of these family court cases that involve attachment pathology and highly litigated and custody conflict sort of things should receive a proper risk assessment for possible child psychological abuse by the allied parent, a shared persecutory delusion. Family systems description is a cross-generational coalition resulting in an emotional cutoff because the child's triangulated into the spousal conflict. So it's not new knowledge, it just needs to be applied. And so that's a differential. If there's an allegation of child abuse against the targeted parent and saying that's a two-person parent-child conflict, two-person attribution of causality, that the parent is doing something abusive to the child, thereby resulting in the child's attachment pathology to that parent, then that's a rule out of possible child abuse by the targeted parents. So that needs a proper assessment. The alternative diagnosis, if there's no child abuse there, is that it's a three-person triangle, which family systems recognizes that family conflict always breaks down into three-person conflicts. So in this case, it's not a parent-child conflict, it's a parent-child-parent triangle. The child's caught in the middle. And so that needs a proper risk assessment, which is for a possible shared persecutory delusion, creating the child's attachment pathology. And if that's present, the DSM-5 diagnosis would be child psychological abuse, V995.51. Now, an extension, though, to consider that and put it on a rule out and assess for it, is a possible factitious disorder imposed on another. The DSM-5 diagnosis for that, or diagnostic number for that, is 300.19. So that's a diagnosis that needs to be put on the table and looked at. That it's a creation of a false pathology, a factitious disorder, that's then imposed on the child for secondary gain of the parent. The secondary gain is nullification of court orders, possibly revenge and retaliation against the spouse, so it's possibly spousal abuse as well. And the means or the associated features of creating that FDIA, the factitious disorder, is not a histrionic personality as it might be for the medical version. It's a narcissistic borderline dark triad, vulnerable dark triad, dark tetrad personality. And it's particularly the Machiavellian manipulation and exploitation component of that. So I just wanted to share that differential diagnosis that I'm applying or recommending be assessed in my individual reports as I review mental health treatment reports with all of you, so that you're aware of where we're headed, you're aware of where Dr. Childress is going and the diagnostic issues involved. And the FDIA diagnosis is, I would argue in many of these cases, the spot-on accurate diagnosis. And if it's Munchausen by proxy, that's a child psychological abuse diagnosis again. So that V995.51 child psychological abuse is applicable in all of these cases. And the shared delusional disorder, I'd suggest you reference the Walters and Friedlander quote that says that it happens in this pathology, and they cite me for that, so that will also bring in some of my work as relevant to the court. The uh, let me, I'm not going to spend long with you this morning. I have things to run out and do, but the in sharing where or how this is going to resolve itself moving forward, we need professional competence over here. And it's not professional competence in new made up pathologies that I'm some sort of expert in. There's not a single expert over here. Me maybe, but there's no experts over here. Not in attachment pathology, not in personalities disorders, not in factitious disorder imposed on another, not in delusional thought disorders, not in child abuse and trauma. The There's forensic psychologists who don't know any of that and don't apply any of that. They come here basically to exploit parents for their money, solve nothing. And then there's the Gardner's PAS experts who are continuing to be here from 1985 who think there's a whole new pathology and they want to get it into the DSM-5. But they don't know attachment pathology or factitious disorder or personality disorder, family system. So there's not an actual expert anywhere to be found. In fact, there's not even competence, basic competence, standard 2.01, basic competence. That's not even here. That should be here. The licensing board should be requiring competence out of the forensic people who are doing the custody evaluation, but they don't. The reason they don't is because the licensing boards surrounding court-involved conflict is considered a subspecialty, so that's the domain of forensic psychologists on the licensing board. So they are allowed to self-review, and they just exempt themselves from all ethical standards, all competence standards, all duty to protect. They just say because they all do it. And as long as they all do it, then they are safe from retaliation. And so they don't interfere with the pathology, so the pathological parent doesn't retaliate, and you targeted parents are not don't have sufficient power to challenge the custody evaluators on their recommendations. So what I'm providing you is with the professional knowledge surrounding competence so that you can challenge their competence. But ultimately, this is going to be the licensing boards need to stand up and start enforcing competence issues, or the individual psychologists are going to have to face malpractice lawsuits. And so, one of the things I'm suggesting is that when it's warranted, that parents start filing licensing board complaints all the time when it's warranted on competence grounds. 2.01, 2.04, bases for scientific and professional judgments, 9.01, bases for assessment. And those all kind of link into a little nodule there. They don't know the knowledge, so therefore they don't apply the knowledge. And the reason because they don't apply the knowledge, their assessments are not based on sufficient information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings, and failure in their duty to protect. They didn't do a proper risk assessment for possible psychological child abuse of the child and for possible spousal psychological abuse of the parent. And so, when warranted, file those licensing board complaints. They will get shunted over to the forensic psychologists who would do exactly the same thing. But if they see these complaints coming in, you'll be forcing them to do two things. One is either continually collude with the incompetence in the field. Now, they're the licensing board, but they're going to have to continually collude with the violation of ethical standards and competence and not hold the other forensic psychologists competent, or they're going to recognize that they themselves on the licensing board are not competent and are in violation of exactly the same standards that this other psychologist was in violation of. So I don't know what they're going to do on that. Hopefully they will start enforcing professional standards of practice with your families in the family courts. Once we get basic competence, Then we can start talking about getting expertise over here. We should have the highest standards of practice. The decisions before the court are monumental. Oh my, they can affect the child's life, the remainder of the child's life. And the potential tragedy and trauma to the child and to the parent from psychological child abuse and from spousal psychological abuse is devastating. And when you have dark triad and dark tetrad, you got sadism and narcissism and psychopathy as in one personality disorder parent, and these mental health and the court system are giving custody to that dark triad or dark tetrad parent who's the worst possible parent. And they were giving full custody because they have manipulated the courts and manipulated the mental health people. Manipulated the mental health people because they're so ignorant, manipulated the courts because the mental health people are so ignorant. There's two problems here that you all face, and the broken systems. The mental health system is broken in the family courts. The legal system is as a result broken in the family courts. I The solution is to first fix the broken mental health system, and then we leverage the fixed mental health system to fix the broken legal system. But the primary cause of the problem is over here with the psychologists. And it arose back in the 1980s when we created this special field for all of you of forensic child custody evaluators. And they left the field of clinical practice, diagnosis and treatment, to enter the world of forensic practice, of being like mini judges, of deciding who gets to be a parent, who deserves to be. And so they're in a judgment role on this, not a treatment role. And that's extraordinarily problematic for a doctor. We're not allowed to harm anybody. And when we start making custody decisions, if we restrict either parent's time and involvement with the child, we are damaging that child's attachment bond to that parent, which will harm the child and harm the parent. So if there's no child abuse, parents have the right to parent according to their cultural values, their personal values, and their religious values. If there's no child abuse, we shouldn't be getting involved as psychologists. And if there's no child abuse, then each parent should have as much time and involvement with the child as possible. How much time and involvement does that entail? That's the court's decision. That's not my decision. There's basically only two schedules. There's shared 50-50. You can do that week on, week off, or you can kind of mix them up, a couple days here, a couple days there. But it's basically something around shared roughly 50-50. Or that one parent gets school week primary parent, the other one gets every other weekend with a night during the week. That's your basic two custody schedules, and I'm confident the court can decide on that based on all the issues. The issue that emerges is the child's pathology. The child's pathology is somehow messing up whatever the court's decision was on custody. The court just decides 50-50, and the child's saying, I don't want to go be with that parent, and now we're all into them. That's a mental health issue. And so the court seeks mental health guidance, but instead it gets these forensic people who are trying to be mini judges. They're out of their lane. They went into the court system. They never should have done that. And so that's why I'm over here as a court-involved clinical psychologist. I'm not a forensic psychologist. I'm court-involved. I'm in the forensic system, but I'm a clinical psychologist. I assess, diagnose, and treat pathology, and I have no opinion on custody. The court can decide on custody. But the issue becomes, is there child abuse? In the absence of child abuse, parents are allowed to parent to their values. In the absence of child abuse, each parent should have as much time and involvement with the child as possible. In the absence of child abuse, to restrict either parent's time harms the child and harms the parent. So the only question for us psychologists is there child abuse? And with this pathology, the two child abuse domains that are of concern are the shared persecutory delusion and factitious disorder imposed on another, having to do with a narcissistic borderline dark triad, vulnerable dark triad, dark tetrad personality pathology of a parent. And that personality pathology of the parent is really severe. If you misdiagnose this pathology, you are doing exactly the wrong thing. We are leaving the child with the severely pathological parent and restricting to nothing the child's time with the normal range parent. That is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. But the courts and the mental health people are being manipulated into this by the Machiavellian manipulation of the dark personality pathology. So, so my work is to engage the professional responsibilities, ethical responsibilities, duty to protect responsibilities, competence issues. And so I recommend that parents, when it's appropriate, file the licensing board complaints because that's the appropriate steps to do for ethical violations and practice violations is to alert the licensing board to the issues. When the licensing boards don't do anything, well, then contact your legislator, state legislature, and say, can you please look into the licensing board because they're not doing anything. People can always talk to me, attorneys and state legislators and major media, anybody you want to direct my way to explain the situation, I can explain it. Ultimately, we will need the American Psychological Association to come in and start holding some like upper level professional conferences or to produce some white papers to look at the issues, similar to how they looked at cultural psychology back in the 80s. And so they had some higher level conferences of experts in cultural psychology in various domains to work out cultural standards. We need something like that from the APA. The other thing I think would be extraordinarily helpful is a pilot program for the family courts that would have university involvement to where the university expertise could be applied to helping develop the diagnostic assessment protocol and the treatment protocol for family courts, and hopefully also the legal arguments to support that. And so thereby eliminate all the fighting about what the assessment protocol is, what the treatment protocol is. And I can put one together, Dorsey Pruder, I would put one together with an ABPA, which means the application of applied knowledge, basically. So an ABPA/High Road, I would include the High Road workshop as a transition point between the diagnosis and the treatment because it's really effective in recovering children quickly. And so that would be my recommendation is a pilot program into the family courts to stop the arguments. But I don't put those together. I'm a lone clinical psychologist working in private practice. So what I'm doing is just holding mental health people accountable one by one until somebody cares enough to come over here and create the solution. Technically, that's called disrupting the homeostatic balance. The systems are stable with the symptom present. And the symptom in this case is the incompetence. And so the dysfunctional systems need the incompetence because otherwise they will collapse into chaos. And so we cannot remove the symptom of incompetence because every aspect of the system, every aspect, will seek to maintain the symptom in place. So that's one way to describe it. The other way to describe it would be Friston and his free energy principle, that we're basically lazy brains. It has to do with energy and entropy. It takes a lot of energy to work our brains, so we don't want to work so much. So we basically predict the world and sample it, and as long as it stays within our predicted expectations, we don't really think about it too much. And so all of our energy is bound into taking care of our needs until something surprises us about the world and we go, wait a minute, that's not what I expected. And it could be dangerous because it's not what I expected. So here, let me pay attention to that. Let me free up some energy to pay attention to it. But then that takes energy, and it's problematic for the overall system. So we don't like to do that. But we need that surprisal event. That's what it's called, a surprisal, to draw our attention to release some of that free energy. So those are the two ways to think about professionally what's happening right now. Either we need to disrupt the homeostatic balance. Homeo, the same. Static never changes. A same that never changes. And the symptom is stabilizing it. That's all out of the systems, family systems, and systems work. Or thinking about it in terms of providing them with a surprisal event that will free up the energy necessary for them to um, commit to begin solving the pathology in the family courts. There's a lot of good clinical psychologists out there. The problem that you all will face is they won't work with you. They refuse. I did that for my whole life because you're too professionally dangerous. I've faced licensing board complaints. I face malpractice lawsuits from the dark triad, dark tetrad personalities. They are massively vengeful, and I'm interfering with what they want to do. So they want me gone. So they're going to try to attack me. I face retaliation from the forensic psychologists from on the boards. So they want to get at me. I've got an Oregon thing. The only use of my custody or to my custody resolution method report to Dorsey, the only use for that report was to file a licensing board complaint against the psychologist in Oregon. And instead of looking at the psychologist in Oregon, the Oregon board sanctioned me. The forensic psychologists on the Oregon board sanctioned me because I wasn't a forensic psychologist. It's under appeal to the courts, and we'll open that up once we get resolution on some things. But so I face retaliation from the forensic psychologist because I'm trying to help you. I face retaliation from the pathological parent because I try to help you. And I face a opposing counsel in cross-examination whose sole job in the universe is to discredit my testimony by any way possible. About 50% of them try to do it by slandering my reputation or by trying to put me in a position where I'm going to get sanctioned somehow for my testimony or my reports. So I've got an attorney, the licensing boards, the forensic psychologists, and a pathological parent all want to harm me. No, I'm not working with your families. No, it's too dangerous. So we gave you your own special psychologists. They're like our bomb disposal unit. And we don't care what they do. They can do anything they want to protect themselves because it's a little passive aggressive from the clinical psychologist. You're going to threaten my license? Fine. Here, I have a bunch of psychologists and good luck with them. And so there's a little passive aggressive thing off of the clinical psychologist. And then we walked away. That's where the APA is in here looking at things. We don't care. The clinical psychologists do not care. That we've given you over to your own special psychologist. Good luck with them. And so it's the risk factor that needs to be addressed, which is why I'm here. Look at me. I'm an old clinical psychologist. I've worked at every possible level. I know a lot of stuff. I'm senior staff level. If not me, who? Who can come over here and walk the path of clinical psychology in the courts and remain relatively safe? And so if what I'm doing is I'm providing a path for the other clinical psychologists to return to court-involved practice, not custody, treatment. And that treatment depends on diagnosis. We need to get an accurate diagnosis. What's the accurate diagnosis? Shared persecutory delusion, factitious disorder imposed on another. Both of those are child psychological abuse. Both of those are spousal abuse, psychological abuse using the child as a weapon. So we have the abuse diagnoses, child abuse, spousal abuse diagnoses, and some pretty severe pathology in the family courts that needs to be diagnosed and assessed. So with all of that morning's information, I'm going to be heading off to my daily tasks here, and we'll meet next week. I'll pop right back in. I'm planning to switch this over to a Sunday. Just it just fits a little bit better. So next Sunday, join me again, 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'll have coffee and crumpets together. All right, take care. Bye bye.